waiting for it to come.
There are 9 people on the same.
Right, 76. Yeah. And that rolls around.
Can you hear me? All right. Hello, welcome to CCHS's first speaker series for the 2025 year. As always, we're excited to start these up, and we have lots of interesting speakers this year. Next month, we have Victoria Scanella, who will be discussing the rum runners in the area and Prohibition. And then we have Colin Ramsey in March. He will be discussing propaganda in World War II and its connection to maritime history. Today we have Paulie Wenger. He is a PhD student in American Civilization at the University of Delaware. He is also a senior adjunct instructor in History and Sociology at Atlantic Cape Community College. He has worked at several New Jersey museums, including the Burlington County Prison Museum, Princeton University Art Museum, and Whitesbog Preservation Trust. Thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Make sure you can all hear me good. Awesome. Nice to meet you all. Let's jump right into it here. On a cold December day in 1860, Salem police officer John H. Cogill was on a hunt. He was a hardy man, born in 1819 in New York, and he had come to Salem County, New Jersey at a young age, where he first worked as a farmer. Later, he was named the Surveyor of Highways from 1854 to 1856, and finally he was named as a police officer in the city. Although records do not exist describing his personality, we can assume through his achievements that he was both a smart and politically active man. In fact, earlier that year, Cogill was elected as the Sergeant at Arms for the New Jersey State Senate, a position that he would hold during one of the most historic moments in New Jersey's history. Only 2 months after that day in December of 1860, Cogill would find himself in Trenton as President-elect Abraham Lincoln arrived in New Jersey for the first time to speak to the Garden State. In his characteristically high-pitched voice, Lincoln addressed each branch of the New Jersey legislature. Speaking to the Senate, he referred to the majority of the politicians who, quote, did not think that he was the man, but spoke graciously of their support for the Constitution and the Union. Remembering graciously the many struggles that took place in New Jersey during the American Revolution, Lincoln spoke of himself as, quote, the humble instrument of the Almighty, and of this, his most chosen people, for perpetuating the object of that great struggle. In essence, pleading for the continuity, or the continuing, the struggle for the American Union. Now, Cogill played a minor role that day. He was in charge of security. But on that day in December of 1860, Cogill was on the hunt for a problem that had been terrorizing Salem County for some months. Shopkeepers across the county had been receiving counterfeit banknotes that had been altered. Notes from the Millville, Gloucester County, and Union Bank of Delaware had been altered crudely from $1 and $2 notes to represent tens. The shopkeepers themselves were embarrassed. As the local newspaper, the Salem Sunbeam, chided, "It is astonishing how any businessman or any mere tyro in paper money could ever be deceived so as to receive them as genuine." However, counterfeiting was a serious problem in the United States at this time. In fact, before the United States began printing its own paper currency, the task fell to state and private banks. Usually, those banks would deposit assets to the state government and in return could hire an engraver to design and print notes that were redeemable by the bank in an equivalent amount of gold or silver coins. The historian Stephen Mim wrote of the enterprising growth of banknotes, stating, "Only a few banks issued notes in 1790s, close to 200 did so by 1815, and by 1830, the number had climbed to 321. By 1850, with the exponential growth of banking, there were 10,000 different kinds of banknotes in the United States. Because of the vast differences in currency, these notes became a haven for men willing to use them for nefarious gains. Now, as Cogill worked his way through the case, he found himself being pulled away from the city of Salem and out to the bustling countryside. Particularly, he found himself in Upper Alloway Creek, near Alloway's Town in Quinton Township. He soon arrived at the home of the suspected counterfeiter. It was a sprawling farm with orchards teeming with various fruits. It was idealistic, but it was also the home of perhaps the most famous authoress in the entirety of southern New Jersey, and her name was Tamar Davis. Can we go to our next slide? Okay. Now, the newspapers were not kind following Tamar Davis's arrest for counterfeiting in 1860. Accounts reported that the author, whom editors printed was remunerated beyond her claims by publishers in New York and Boston, had altered $1 notes by adding a zero. Yet each printing of the arrest included a different barb about who Davis was. The Camden Democrat attested that her arrest was the result of, quote, insanity induced by spiritualism. Meanwhile, the Massachusetts Weekly Spy simply called her, quote, a pretender to literature. It seems strange for the editors, many of whom also praised her as a notable literary woman, to react so violently towards her at the first glimpse of trouble. However, for a self-described, quote, infidel, who newspapers argued, quote, generally espoused the contrary side to all political opinions, the indignation of newspaper editors must not have only been expected, but was in fact the greatest reward. Through a glimpse of the fiery writings of Tamar Davis, a voice not frequently heard in American history can be recovered. It's an opportunity not only to examine important topics such as free thought, anti-liquor laws, and the impact of slavery through the lens of a woman in antebellum and Civil War era New Jersey, but the life of one of the state's most unique writers. Can we go to the next slide? Now, little is known about the life of Tamar Davis before she began writing. What is known is that she was born Tamar Ayers on January 23, 1821, to Ollie and Phoebe Ayers in Salem County, New Jersey, where she would spend much of her life. Both of her parents were lineal descendants of Robert Ayers, one of the earliest European settlers in West Jersey. Ayers, born in England around 1650, emigrated to the United States in 1664 and settled in New England. When Stephen and Ann Mumford united with 5 members to form the Rhode Island Seventh-day Baptist Church on January 3, 1672, Ayers would be among those that would eventually convert. The core tenets of the new church required that the Baptist observe the Sabbath, or Saturday, as a holy day of God, and around 1685, Ayers and his family moved to the new Quaker settlement of West Jersey and settled near the south side of the Cohansey River on 800 acres, which in what is now known as Shrewsbury Neck. He would later purchase 2,200 acres, covering parts of the present site of Shiloh. Frank D. Andrews, the compiler of the 1918 biography, wrote, "We may believe he was a constant member and leader in the Sabbatarian sect he embraced, faithful in the performance of duty, reverent, thoughtful, and devoted to his family and his God." Now, the founding document from the 1811 creation of the Marlborough Seventh-day Baptist Church sported among the signatures that of Phoebe, as well as her sister, also named Tamar Ayers. She would eventually die August 8th, 1832. Now, the founding document declared a separation from the Shiloh Church as necessary, quote, "for the accommodation of our brethren and the glory of God, if our hearts deceive us not," but more practically because people wanted a church closer to where they lived. Although Marlborough records do not differentiate between Phoebe's sister and daughter, Tamar might only appear once in an entry on June 7th, 1829, in which it declares the sisters, quote, "Patience Ayers, Tamar Ayers, and Eunice Moore agreed to sweep and sand the floor every 2 weeks for a year of free gratis." One surprising name omitted from the church document was Tamar's father, Ollie, whose disappearance from the church records might might be due to remaining with the Shiloh church, or perhaps they were not married yet. There's no references to Tamar's later non-religious work relating to her father, so we can't assume that. And though Tamar Davis wrote little about her early life, it is apparent she was raised in a uniquely religious and familial location. Both the Shiloh and Marlborough church records feature many descendants of Robert Ayers, which formed a tight-knit community due to their communal denominational beliefs. Next slide. Now, on November 21st, 1840, when Tamar was 19, she married Richard Bond Davis, who was a prominent farmer in the area. Although early copies of the paper are scarce, somewhat, she evidently began writing for the local newspaper called the Bridgeton Chronicle. But it would be through her first book, published under her own name, that Davis would begin to attract national attention. Her earliest writing came in January of 1851 in the Sabbatarian newspaper, the Sabbath Recorder, discussing whether it was correct to state that man was still the image of God. Later that year, Davis published A General History of the Sabbatarian Church, which is the name of the book, which was highly promoted in newspapers across the United States. As what she calls, quote, the pioneer in the field of Sabbatarian church research, Davis's work was massive. It encompassed 255 pages of church history from across the world, including chapters on church history located in Armenia, the Indian subcontinent, and Ethiopia. Interestingly, though her later work would be highly critical of the Sabbatarians, this early work was not only kind of a history of it, but it praises the history of the church heavily. Now, though little is known about Davis's education, it's pretty apparent from the start she has the makings of a historian. In the introduction to her book, she refers to writing only the facts, describing, quote, it has been my aim to collect, collate, and condense facts as much as appeared consistent with perspicuity. I have not taken any new stand with regard to the Sabbath question. Now, her book is a mixture of oral history, church documents, and folk tales, and it clearly was not entirely meant to be only theological, but in fact, a history of the church as much as she could put together. Now, it's pretty incredible. She doesn't write about how she knew about the history of Ethiopia or the Indian subcontinent. She doesn't mention traveling anywhere. So it's kind of something fun to think about how she put together that history inside of it. Now, Davis's church history can also be used to understand some details about her personal religious experiences, because she wrote extensively about the Marlborough and Shiloh churches. She described the Sabbatarian churches of New Jersey as, quote, large and efficient bodies distinguished in early times when the denomination was in an infant state, for wealth and respectability of character, and for pastors of eminent piety and worth. Of the four churches described in New Jersey, it is the one in Shiloh, Cumberland County, which receives the most attention from Davis, which also makes sense, of course, when recognizing all of her familial connections to it. Davis, initially positive of the teaching in New Jersey, wrote the pastors of the churches, quote, however deficient they might appear in the graces of elegant diction, were distinguished for sound reasoning and plain sense. Their zeal was tempered with moderation, their piety with rationality. However, she, of course, did also criticize them a little bit, writing that the new pastors were, quote, disposed to harp on opinions and debatable points. This new method of preaching, she thought, would eventually lead to, quote, a general dearth of religious feelings. Now, can we do a new slide here? Great. Now, in the book, Davis mentioned non-belief only once, in the story of Reverend Joseph Maxson of Newport, Rhode Island, who allegedly had a neighbor, quote, notorious for infidel principles and unchristian content, who would refuse to listen to the preaching of Maxson. As the neighbor was returning home one day, the story remarked that he found what appeared to be a dropped Bible, with the verse, "'Twas for me, thy soul death tasted, seeking me, thy worn feet hastened, let such labor not be wasted." inscribed on the front cover. Davis wrote that he was so stricken by these words that he soon began reading the Bible to find the passage, which ultimately led to the poor non-believer being converted. The inclusion of the story is humorous, considering Davis's later writings on non-belief, but the exclusion of any rebuttal against the story shows that she was still very committed to her beliefs at this point. Now, it's not exactly known what might have caused Davis, who was such a fervent believer in the work of the Seventh-day Baptist Church, to sway her opinion. Perhaps it was the death of her parents, Phoebe in 1852 and Ollie the following year, that challenged her original upbringing or allowed her to change her mind. More likely, however, are the responses that she got to her history book. Because to say that the Seventh-day Baptist Church liked her book would not be true. On May 25th, 1851, at a meeting of the Eastern Association of Sabbatarian Churches in Berlin, New York, I.D. Titsworth, a member of the Shiloh Church, rose to his feet just as the event was ending. And he, quote, said, "Whereas Miss Tamar Davis of Shiloh, New Jersey, has recently written and published a book purporting to be a history of the Seventh-day Baptist denomination, which book contains, quote, various historical inaccuracies and also a number of improper personal criticisms upon the talents and abilities of several of our ministers, one of which we regard as being an unjust and ridiculous assault against Brother William M. Jones, and therefore resolved that the association deems said book unworthy of a place in the libraries of the Seventh-day Baptist Church." Now, of this assumed attack against William Jones, we can be absolutely sure that she absolutely said this. She said that Jones was, quote, "a man of inferior abilities and attainments, and one disposed to meddle with subjects above his capacity for information." That seems pretty harsh to say against another person in your book. Now, this attack by not only church leaders, but ones as local as Shiloh, left Davis stung by this assessment of her writing. She responded in a letter to the Sabbath Recorder, published on June 26, saying, "A book teaching on every page that the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God is declared to be a worthless production." She demanded that the paper, which had earlier published that her book was, quote, "a worthless production and not entitled to confidence," give definitive reasons for that unjust and illiberal criticism and show from the book itself that it is a worthless production. Now, to this, the editor of the paper said, "Well, we don't really own the book, but we saw the book when we were traveling in New York. And when I saw the book, quote, I soon saw that the marks of great haste were made in preparation of the book, and that we came to the conclusion that it was not worth being received by the public as a reliable history of our denomination." Now, they finished their statement with a sharp rebuke to Davis, saying, "Hence came our criticism, of which the authoress so loudly complains." No further articles or replies were published to or about Davis in the book, but the very funny thing about this is that her book, and in fact, one of the only places I've actually ever seen this book physically was actually here, is that it, to this day, is one of the sources used by Sabbatarian church historians today. So even though the Sabbatarians hated this book, if you look at the sources for the future history books written about the church, they mostly pull from Davis's work. Now, can we go to the next slide here? Excellent. Sorry, I skipped this one as well. Next one. Excellent. Whatever the cause of Davis's disillusionment, Davis's first brush with criticism for organized religion came through a letter and poem sent to the Boston Investigator that was published on June 9th, 1852. First published by Abner Neeland in Boston in 1831, the Boston Investigator was the first American newspaper to focus solely on the discussion of free thought. Historian Susan Jacoby, in her book Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism, described free thought as, quote, "often defined as a total absence of faith in God. Free thought can be better understood as a phenomenon running the gamut from the truly anti-religious, those who regard all religion as a form of superstition and wish to reduce its influence in every aspect of society, to those who adhere to a private, unconventional faith revering some for God or providence, but at odds with orthodox religious authority. Now, to say that you are a free thinker or that you are an infidel does not necessarily mean you are an atheist. This was a catch-all term at the time. Now, during the history of the newspaper from 1831 to 1904, the subscribers would include deists, agnostics, and atheists that ranged from ordinary citizens to popular orators like the great agnostic Robert G. Ingersoll. By the end of Nealon's tenure as publisher, the paper would be sold by 243 different agents and include a subscriber base of 2,500 in 27 states and territories, which is pretty massive for the time. However, my favorite bit about it is that at one point, the Boston Investigator sported a very notable publisher, and that was John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States. Now, Nealand himself is an interesting guy. He was born in Massachusetts in 1774, and he became a lay preacher for a Baptist church before eventually converting to Universalism. And he became a minister. Over time, he would break away from the Universalist church altogether in favor of free thought and pantheism, or the belief that the wider universe is the same as a supreme deity. Over time, he would work as a newspaperman in New York and Philadelphia, but he'd really catch on with the Boston Investigator in 1831. As I mentioned, John Quincy Adams for a short time was the publisher of the newspaper, which was rather unique. Now, his writing sparked a ton of anger, including even a fiery blasphemy trial in 1838, which resulted in him being sent to jail for 60 days. A number of notable figures in the United States attempted to aid in his release, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and William Lloyd Garrison, but they were unsuccessful and he had to serve his full 60-day term. Even with this infamous reputation, Nealand's paper was successful and garnered a significant amount of talented correspondence. Can we go to our next slide here? Now, in her first submission to the Investigator, Davis sent in both a poem and a statement. Her poem, titled Missions, criticized the religious missions that she thought cared less about relieving the sorrows of the poor than in converting the locals to the missionaries' form of religion. In her poem, Davis wrote that caring for the sick and weak, quote, is a mission for the wise, diviner than to stand and teach of wonders, marvels, mysteries, and all things beyond human reach. The hopes and dreams of vapid faith are what a Hebrew legend saith. She finished her poem by suggesting that the only way to clear the human heart is by bidding superstition's power depart. Her other piece, titled Infidel, which received a prominent position on the first page of the issue, gave insight into the views of her small town in New Jersey. She told the story of 2 or 3 friends debating whether it was an insult to be called an infidel. One friend, Davis asserts, offered that any particular infidel was a, quote, mean, vulgar, low, black-hearted wretch, to which she reported, the other friend, likely being a stand-in for herself, asserts the words of the Christian philosopher Lord Francis Bacon in saying that, quote, atheism leaves to man reason, philosophy, reputation, honor, laws, and natural piety, while superstition destroys all of these and erects into a tyranny over the understandings of men. The initial friend then rebuts, saying that they might be correct, but in this community, a robber or a murderer professing religion on the scaffold is tolerable to one who chooses to think for himself in matters of faith. Now remember, this is only a 1-year change from her history book about the Seventh-day Baptist Church to writing that in this community, it was better to be a murderer than an unbeliever. From this anecdote, Davis's view of religious skepticism comes into focus. She describes her self-appraisal term infidel as, quote, dissidence from the fashionable creed, whether that of Buddha, Muhammad, or Christ, which implicated no stain on moral character, since even the atheist is possessed of all the feelings, instinct, and sympathies that are required to lead him to virtue. She places the crux of her criticism on followers of unproven superstition, which she condemned for imprisonment, torturing and killing philosophers who dared to think, and also those that did not support populist movements, such as her denunciation of Martin Luther. Among the infidels that Davis placed in high regard were Socrates, Galileo, Lord Byron, and of course, like Americans' leading deist, Thomas Jefferson. She finished her piece with an argument against the priest of Europe who served to suppress the freedoms of the people through supporting divine authorities of kings. Now, while she never wrote an exact description of her belief, she didn't say if she was a deist, an agnostic, or an atheist, this piece served as her kind of coming out moment for the investigator. In fact, it was evidently well received. The editor of the paper absolutely loved it. He wrote, "This lady is a stranger to our columns, but after the very sensible communication and beautiful poetic gem that she kindly furnished, we hope to have the pleasure of hearing from her often, and if she will allow us of considering her a permanent contributor." Though no personal correspondence from Davis has survived, she soon began writing a litany of articles for the Boston Investigator. Next slide, please. However, just as her career as a correspondent was starting, Davis was drawn into two very public fights. The first would involve one of the most important novels ever published in the United States. For in 1852, an advertisement appeared stating that Miss Tamar Davis of Allowaystown, New Jersey, was preparing a work for the press to be a counterpart to Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. They said that the scene would be laid out in New Jersey, where there are several villages occupied by, quote, colored people. Now, this was a huge issue. I don't know if folks realize how important Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel was. This is something that Lincoln was reportedly said, something that had helped cause the Civil Wars, the mythology story behind it. And here she was writing a response to it. What did this mean? Was it going to be something that is totally against being, I should mention, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin is an anti-slavery book. So is she going to be writing a book that is pro-slavery? Well, unfortunately for us, that is exactly that. Her book is absolutely not an abolitionist story. In fact, of the few writings that exist before her 1851 book on Sabbatarian churches, it's pretty clear that Tamar Davis did not believe in the equality of enslaved peoples or free African Americans. On January 9th, 1851, Davis published an article in the Sabbath Recorder titled "Equality Among the Races," in which she argued for the exact opposite. She said, "Let the slave laws be abolished, let them be raised to every political privilege, but even then he will not be equal with the Caucasian." Davis would later argue that she was not prejudiced against African Americans, and she knew at, quote, whose door the sin of their degradation lies. However, it is pretty apparent that at no point did Davis ever write about the possibility of equality being attained. And in fact, later in 1862, she would write a 4-part series about slavery in New Jersey and its effects. She said, for the most part, the only real effect of abolition in New Jersey was that the horrors of slavery were now sent to the women of the farming communities. So basically, she said, look at what has happened in the aftermath of freeing the enslaved peoples. Well, the burden has switched to the farmer's wife, and look how degraded they are, and look how awful they look, and all these kinds of things. So it's pretty clear from this, she was absolutely no friend to the abolition movement. Now, the newspapers wrote that Davis was to publish a novel. I've never found the novel. I did find a link to the story in a newspaper called the Georgia Constitutional Union, which unfortunately no longer exists. It's my belief that that newspaper is a casualty to the Civil War. But I did find a couple stories that kind of branch off here. This one, titled "The Northern Prejudice Against Persons of Color," was printed in the Cecil Whig in Maryland, and it revolves around a fugitive slave, a free, formerly enslaved girl who is living with an abolitionist family. You guys can probably guess what religion the abolitionist family is in her story, because she's going to be going against them. They were Seventh-day Baptists in the story. And she says, this is an abolitionist family that talks about how horrible slavery is, but look at how they treat their working person, their servant in their home. They treat her just as bad as they do in the South. Now, clearly, this is a pro-slavery work trying to say slavery's not that bad in the South. See, we treat them just as bad up here, so we don't even need to be talking about it. In fact, when she was later criticized about this, she would say this is more about the hypocrisy of abolitionists in the North, and she invoked the name of Thomas Jefferson in asking her critics to, quote, point out one state in the Union in which they are regarded and treated as men. Now, to kind of show how pro-slavery this is, the Cecil Whig, which is a Maryland-based newspaper, who Maryland had slavery at the time, said that their Southern readers would, quote, confer a favor by giving public notice to this work because it would rectify the work of Miss Stowe, who has drawn such horrible pictures of slavery, and the condition of those who have fled for the refuge of the strongholds of abolition. They're saying to our Southern readers, look, this is rectifying all those terrible things they said about slavery. Like I said, she would be criticized pretty heavily, including by the National Anti-Slavery Standard, the leading abolitionist newspaper at the time, who said she has written a book to promote slavery, a beautiful and lovely state of society, and it is a determined opponent of the temperance movement. In response to this, she wrote a response back saying, I never wrote such a book praising slavery, and I challenge the world to produce such a book. She also took exception at their kind of slight of her position as a wife and a mother, saying that I boldly publish my opinion should not be a reproach to those who contend for the largest liberty in that respect, or is freedom of speech and opinion only to be tolerated on the popular side. Though as forceful as her rebuttal was to the newspaper, I think we can pretty much say this absolutely was a miss for Davis. But even looking at her writings on the subject, we get a feel for what Cumberland County and Salem County was like during the time. Can we go to our next slide? The second issue that she got involved with was the Maine Liquor Law of 1851. Now, the Maine Liquor Law was the first law in the United States that banned the sale of liquor for recreational use. They still allowed liquor production for things like ethanol and creation for industry, but it was the first one passed that would stop the sale of alcohol for consumption. Now, she entered the controversy in 1853 and wrote to denounce the temperance movement in New Jersey. Now, she didn't necessarily disagree with it based on the effects of the law. She disagreed because she felt that it was anti-democratic. Who was the government to step in and tell people what they can and can't do with liquor? In her view, restricting the availability of liquor to all Americans based on the idea that someone could not restrain themselves was unconstitutional. And at this point, the Maine Liquor Law, which had only been in that one state, had started branching out into places like New York and Pennsylvania and some others. And she really did not want that to happen in New Jersey. And in fact, to support this argument, she published a well-received pamphlet called A Book for the Million, which was published in Bridgeton, New Jersey. Of course, her role in denouncing the Maine Liquor Law was highly controversial. Who was this woman stepping in and telling people what they can and can't do and what laws should be passed? In fact, one article by a man named Maury Jr., which was kind of a name thrown in there, in the West Jersey Pioneer, decried the, quote, assumptions of one woman in Davis against the pro-Maine law judges. And she responded in a kind of very funny way. She said, quote, if a man in general sense is lord, then men as individuals must be lords, and wonderful lords they are to be sure. Look yonder, Mr. Maury, one of your lords has tumbled beast-like and drunken into that gutter. See, there is another being led into jail for crime. There in that oyster cellar a whole gang of those lords are drinking, gambling, swearing, and committing every species of debauchery. Don't look at them with disgust or scorn, you active, intelligent women. I think that's kind of funny. Now, however, her disdain for the Maine Liquor Law did not mean that Davis was against providing help towards an alcoholic neighbor. In a piece for the Investigator titled, quote, The Temperance Reform, she wrote that, quote, the kindness has taken the wretched inebriate by the hand and made him feel that somebody cared for his welfare and strengthened and supported him in a time of temptation. Let's go to our next slide. Now, before we kind of talk about more of her life as a columnist, it's also important to mention she was extremely successful as a novelist. While she was writing poems and columns for newspapers, she gained her most profit through her fiction writing. This included publishing novellas for the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper, which drew from her experiences in southern New Jersey. These included the works Ida the Foundling in 1858, Angela or the Triumph of Love, John Glennie of Pleasant Valley, The Immigrant Families, and Wheel of Fortune. Her fiction work, for the time, women mostly wrote romances, but they were very popular, even just going outside of that. For example, she wrote a poem called The Young Hero in 1863, which celebrated the likely fictional valiant efforts of the 10-year-old son of Captain Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright, who aboard the Harriet Lane in the Civil War held off an attacking force of Confederates who had just killed his father before he was captured. Now, unfortunately for that example, that did happen. Captain Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright did die in a Civil War battle, but there were no records that his son was ever there, and so it was very much just something I think she wrote for a little dramatic flair. But she was very popular. Her books did sell a lot. In fact, the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper had a bounty of $1,000 if you were to win the prize for the best story, and she did win that prize. $1,000 that back then was pretty nice. We go to our next slide here. Now, even while Tamar Davis was growing regionally famous for her fiction writing, she continued to write columns for The Investigator. This included philosophical observations, historical memorandum, and engaging with topics of the day, such as her works on religion. Though she wrote that the subject of religion was not, hold on one second, guys. Here we go. Of Herbert Spencer. There we go. At times, she wrote humorously about what it was like to live as a skeptic in New Jersey. For example, she once wrote an article about a liberal woman, likely a stand-in for herself, taking a stagecoach with a few other people, where a man had argued that Thomas Paine and Voltaire were bad men. The woman responded that she, quote, supposed that they were not exempt from the weakness of common humanity. But did you ever understand that they roasted witches like our pious Puritan ancestors, hung or otherwise persecuted the Quakers? And to this the old man remained silent, which led the woman to continue, quote, if they did not, then they must be very good men in comparison with the clergy. And then after this the party went silent and the old man broached a new subject. Other times her writing grew more serious about the negative effects in the community, such as an example where poor neighbors were sent away to almshouses or sexual assault happening in the churches. A rather contentious example of Salem and Cumberland counties' refusal to interact with her ideas came in the correspondence of November of 1852. In the piece, she talked about taking in the newspaper and also kind of other people hearing about this in the community, which led three priests to come knock on her door to come talk to her. They had heard about this wretched skeptic and they were going to come fix the issue and get her back on track. Now, when they were there, this is kind of an interesting thing for us local history people, they began asking about the fossils nearby that were found in the marl pits. And she wrote that she said nothing based on the premise that it would be discourteous to their character as guests to make any remarks that might compromise their profession. And so for the most part, she said, I know a bit about fossils and how they are formed. They're talking about the Great Flood. Let's just leave it for now and kind of be a good guest, which was kind of nice of her. But this kind of translates to her other part of her writing. She wrote science columns for the Boston Investigator. We're talking 13-piece, sometimes it was 6, sometimes it was 10, sometimes it went up to 13 or 16-piece articles about science, about chemistry, physiology of plants, about geology. And unfortunately, she did write these under a pen name. She wrote these under TD, probably realizing the amount of acceptability for women writers was kind of stopped at science. So like I said, she wrote a 6-part column about the plants, the physiology of plants, and she also wrote a 3-part article about the theory of life. Now, all of these things are great, right? She's been writing novels, columns, poems, science. Unfortunately, these would all come crashing down in the December of 1860. Can we do our next slide? Now, following the arrest, though he was a police officer for Salem County, He believed that Tamar Davis was living in Cumberland County at the time. So he first took her to the Cumberland County court so that she could be arrested, and then to Salem so that she could also be arrested there because money had been found in both places, counterfeit money. Now, for the most part, I should say after she was taken to the court, her trial was set for the following term in January. But was this the full story? An alternate explanation for her arrest was printed in an article in the Boston Investigator. The author, who gave the name FND, did not deny that Tamar Davis had passed an altered $10 note, but claimed that she subsequently refunded the note and did not know of its character at the time. However, he wrote, quote, "A meddling police officer, assisted by a very pious justice of the peace, determined to fasten the whole upon her, being, as they asserted, an infidel and capable of doing anything. The reasoning behind their vitriol towards Davis," the author quoted, "was that she was about to undertake a tour promoting free thought around the United States. Their intentions seemed to not halt. Excuse me. These intentions did not seem to halt after her arrest. In fact, in 1861, a rather humorous advertisement appeared in the New York-based Herald of Progress, in which Davis asserted that she would be willing to go give a speech about any topic as long as they paid her in cheese or sugar, because they were referring to C.M. Stowe, who had said the same. Now, the backlash, as I mentioned, was immediate. The Philadelphia Press described her as illiterate. According to them, quote, "The editor of the Bridgeton newspaper states that her manuscript was of wretched character, although her vigor and rapidity of style compensated for the tedious labor of correcting her copy." As I mentioned, the Camden Democrat claimed that her fall into crime was induced by insanity. Again, this was kind of ridiculous for especially Tamar Davis because she absolutely despised spiritualism. She saw it as an extension of superstition, which we'll get into. Now, we'll get into the crime here just a little bit. According to the reports of the Salem County Court of Oyer and Terminer, and I have to go by the Salem County ones because Bridgeton didn't have, at least from what I could find, didn't have the court records from 1860. I couldn't find them down here, and I couldn't find them in Trenton either. But in Salem County, she was indicted for 3 charges of forging, altering, and falsifying counterfeit banknotes. During the April term of the court, the jury found Davis not guilty and released her. Though this victory in court would not last long, by December of 1864, Davis would once again find herself under indictment for forgery, and though the records do not indicate the arguments or the events in the actual courtroom, the report states that the jury found Tamar Davis guilty and sentenced her that she be sent to the New Jersey State Prison for a term of 1 year of solitary confinement. Now, the very interesting bit, we'll skip that part for now. During this period of trials, so she gets sent to jail for 1 year of solitary confinement, which is pretty brutal for the first place in the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. And during this period, after she gets sentenced to jail, she begins writing poems about other figures who had faced punishment for their beliefs. So she wrote about people like Mary Wollstonecraft and Abner Nealand and Robert Taylor, who was another man in England who was sent to jail for blasphemy. Unfortunately, she goes to jail for the 1 year, and only about a couple months after her release in 1866, she dies. She dies at the home of her daughter in Marlborough. She's only 45 years old when she dies. Now, despite her incarceration and accusations of guilt, Davis was not in a state of poverty at her death, and we can go to the next slide as well. According to her probate record, she was listed as owning 6 chairs, a bookcase with books, a feather and straw bed with pillows, 1 sheet, 1 blanket, 3 quilts, and a rocking chair. Overall, the amount of money that she had, including the money found at her estate at the time of death, was about $1,300, which in today's currency is about $25,000 that she had. So she was doing pretty well at the time of her death. And unfortunately, there were no records to say what she actually died of. Later reports, including one from 1872, stated that she had been addicted to narcotics. I don't know if that's true. It's only one report that I have, but that may have been a cause of death. Now, For exactly where they lived, the closest I've found, you can see on the map here on the left, the map says Richard Bond Davis, so R.B. Davis would be her husband's home, which is now Roberts Road. I went there to go check it out. And in the sale report, because she was declared a lunatic before she died, they had an estate sale in 1865. They list her as having orchards, a farm, and maybe this is why she was against the temperance movement as well. Maybe she was making applejack, right? Apple cider. But where I think her home was, there's no home there anymore, but there are still orchards there. So maybe she was producing alcohol. Now, as I mentioned, 1 month after her death, and we can go to the next slide as well, the New Jersey State Prison, so this is 1 month after her death, the New Jersey State Prison starts to produce a newspaper, which is very fun. This newspaper is the first in New Jersey to be printed, edited, and written by inmates of the jail. It's called the Sunbeam. Not the Salem Sunbeam, but the Sunbeam. Really, really unique for the time. In fact, from my research, it's only the third ever prison newspaper published in the United States. It's an incredible resource, largely unused by general historians, and it described firsthand accounts of criminality, poverty, and the results of a catastrophic war. The first column in the newspaper, however, includes a poem called The Prison Cell by a Prisoner. Now, this is a rather unique poem. In fact, later on, people would write back and say, that was awesome. Like, that was a really great poem. Who did it? But it includes, I'll read a little bit. In a prison cell was the gospel taught, in a prison cell was the pilgrim wrought, and nature her marvels did there unbind to Galileo's immortal mind. There thousands more of the true and tried have prayed and suffering sanctified. Oh, trust me, child, 'tis the truth I tell. There are places worse than a prison cell. Now, I eventually have come to believe that this was written by Tamar Davis while she was incarcerated, and somebody had kept a hold of it after she had left the jail, because about 3 issues later, they respond to somebody asking who the poem was written by, and you can see they say, the author is well known to the literary world and had won an enviable reputation as both a poet and, as a prose and poetical writer, and the writer's term of service ended in June 1865 and is now since deceased. All of those things match up to Tamar Davis, as well as the fact that the poem talks about the narrator is a woman and their children coming to visit her in the jail. So the fact that the point of view is written by a woman, that it was somebody who had been released around the same time Tamar Davis had, and that they had been a known writer, makes me think that that poem was by Tamar Davis. Can we go to the next slide here? Actually, can we go back one? I want to show you guys really quick. This is actually her gravestone. It's in the Marlborough Church graveyard. That makes me assume that perhaps she had gone back to faith at some point before she had died for her to be buried in the graveyard. We don't know that for sure. Like I said, there is only one report in 1872 that says that she might have done so. No idea. All right, next slide here. Now, as I mentioned, she began writing those poems, and they're pretty interesting poems about people who had suffered for their kind of outlandish beliefs. One of those had been Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was an early feminist writer, and of course, she also had a daughter named Mary Shelley, who made Frankenstein. Abner Neeland, Voltaire, Robert Taylor. She wrote about all these figures, and you can kind of read in the poems that she's starting to have a more melancholy belief to it. In 1852, she wrote a poem about Thomas Paine, which was very celebratory, very happy. These are very much like, these people suffered, and I think in my mind, I think she's writing them going, I am suffering just as they are themselves. In fact, for Wollstonecraft, it brought a new kind of feminist edge to her poetry that had not been there before. She wrote, quote, but Wollstonecraft, superior to this, above public opinion, didn't serenely move for women to demand an equal state, an equal freedom, an equal right with men, equal in all things by great nature's plan. Okay. So can we go to the next slide here? We're coming towards our end here in a little bit, but there's a couple more interesting bits that I want to talk about. One of them, we mentioned spiritualism. Now, in 1865, shortly before her death, and I assume this is after she had been released from the prison, she wrote an article about going to see a seance in Vineland. And she went to go see this seance, and apparently they were going to go meet Daniel Webster, the Senator Daniel Webster, one of the most accomplished orators in American history. Now, according to Davis, the media made a grand speech, but as she wrote, quote, "How was I to know that came from the spirit of that great man?" Answers to her follow-up questions were unappealing to Davis, who finished the writing of her experiences by saying, quote, "Material evidence from the other world, admitting that it can be given, ought to be as sure and positive as we were to find it here, but I have never found it to be so." As we kind of mentioned, spiritualism is a 19th century religious movement that believed that individuals can retain consciousness after death and contact the living. This had long been a source of distaste for Davis. In fact, in 1853, she wrote heavily against spiritual knocking, which was the idea that you could communicate with the dead through knocks on wood surfaces. And she thought this was absolutely outrageous. Now, unfortunately, we kind of get to some of the sad parts about her life and also some very interesting bits. After her death in 1866, pretty much no one writes about her ever again. She had been a really famous novelist, perhaps the most famous authoress in South Jersey, but the world seems to simply forget about her. There were no obituaries in any newspapers that she had ever written for. Her books were not reissued, and her poems were not republished. Her papers, correspondence, and drafts were not saved. She simply became a relic of an earlier time. Only on rare occasions was her name ever mentioned, including the one in 1872 when a visitor to the farm of David Ackley noted that it was the former residence of that gifted authoress, Tamar Davis. Joseph H.C. Applegate, giving his initials as JHCA, described how they first visited her in 1857 due to her literary fame. He remarked that she was, quote, "a very superior woman who possessed a fertile and not unbrilliant imagination, large and comprehensive reasoning power, and a well-balanced organization." Tempering her non-religious beliefs, Applegate wrote, quote, "Of the moral excellence or faults of her literature we say nothing. They are their own best interpreter. But her name is public property, and therefore record our regret that such marvelous worth in view of her utter failure of her life." Now, the really interesting bit about Davis's life is that she wrote most of her stuff under either an assumed name or with no name, an anonymous name. So, after her arrest, a few of her contemporary freethinkers wrote to the Investigator to speak of her character. A J.K. from Quinton Bridge, New Jersey, wrote on May 20th to argue, quote, "Few have suffered more for their devotion to an unpopular cause than she has, though she is one of those who would not rather shrink from than court notoriety." Yet, this letter also includes a really, really interesting mention that much of her work had come under an assumed name. One work he wrote passed through 10 editions in 3 months, yet no one had ever mentioned her name in connection to it. Another work had brought, quote, "admiration for vigor and originality," and J.K. finished his letter to the Investigator by proclaiming that the state of New Jersey cannot boast another writer with a tithe of her talent. They also included an addendum on her article in chemistry by adding, "We have been credibly informed that she is the author of a celebrated work which appeared anonymously some years ago in England, and which, like the Letters of Junius, has been attributed to several savants of high literary fame." They went on to say that they were very happy to have such a correspondent writing for them, but unfortunately, I have no idea what that book is. Back then, there was a lot of people who wrote anonymously, and so there are hundreds of books each year that were written anonymously. There have been some updates in using technology and AI to be able to kind of match these things together, but we haven't gotten there yet. It's one of my great unsolved mysteries for her work. In fact, not only was this work so extraordinary that it was published over and over, but apparently it was so well known that subscribers to the newspaper started to guess what the name of the work was. A man named William P. Lippincott added an addendum to a letter denouncing Confederate sympathizers as in the subscribers to guess the title. The name of the book that he asks about is censored, but the editor notes in the response that, quote, "We do not feel at liberty to answer our friend's question any further at this time than to say that according to what we consider positive evidence in the case, he has correctly guessed the title of the book in question. I would kill to know what that book was." Uh, one of my things that hopefully I will eventually figure out. In the preface to her 1997 book, Women Without Superstition, historian and activist, and we'll go to our next slide, Annie Laurie Gaylor wrote, "The work of women freethinkers to liberate the minds and governments from religious dogma has all too often been ignored or relegated to footnotes by historians of free thoughts. In the years since this assessment, some progress has been made to reclaim the lives of notable women, including, for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret Fuller, and Ernestine L. Rose. And they have gained some renewed attention, with Rose even receiving a biography in 2022. Tamar Davis was mentioned with these women all the time when they talked about some of the best correspondence for the newspaper. Larger synthesis of the role of women in these movements includes Laura Schwartz's book about women in England, but there has been no book written about women in the free thought movement in the United States. Tamar Davis, like many of the other American women freethinkers, has long been neglected by historians. As I mentioned, she does not have any books written about her, nor does her skeptical work appear in any footnotes. However, unlike some of these other women that we have talked about, uh, she didn't live in a big city, right? She lived in kind of an economic backwater. She lived as the village atheist in a way, right? Kind of on the outliers of much of the kind of Philadelphia, New York world. So perhaps that is why she doesn't have the same attention as those other women. However, Tamar Davis, who was a poet, novelist, scientist, and perhaps even an inventor or businesswoman, you'll see an advertisement over here of her selling a sewing machine, not only deserves more consciousness in American history, but demands it. She was not a pretender to literature, as her enemies labeled her, but simply someone who was waiting for literature to catch up to her. Thank you all. That's it. Okay, questions, thoughts, ideas, anything? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I was doing grad school at Rowan, and one of our projects was to take a national issue and look for the local New Jersey angle for it. And so I picked Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that's how I found this whole story about, a woman in New Jersey writing a response to most of the responses to Uncle Tom's Cabin were written in like Alabama, Mississippi, places in the deep, deep South. Here you have one on the border state, a place where slavery is still very much kind of up in the air. In fact, by the Civil War, there were still 18 enslaved peoples living in New Jersey, even though we had passed the 1804 Gradual Abolition Act. So I thought that was the most fascinating thing. And then as I looked into her, I'm like, she's writing about religious skepticism in the 1850s. That's pretty incredible. So I fell into it and I'm stuck in it now. 1866. So she was 1821 to 1866, only 45 years old. And it makes me wonder, like, if she had survived another 20, 30 years, because the 1870s and 1880s were the really big part. They called it the golden age of free thought. And that's when you have like Robert G. Ingersoll and things. If she had survived up until that point, would we remember her now? I don't know. I haven't found anything yet. I've talked to the Historical Society, but yeah. Yeah, like especially with like the spiritualist in Vineland as well, kind of breaking outside the norm. We haven't found anything yet. I'll keep looking, but she might have spoken, she definitely spoke in Philadelphia. I know that for a fact. There was an infidel convention in Philadelphia in 1859, and they didn't allow women to really go to it, but she sent a letter to them to be read in front of everyone. But I think she actually spoke there as well. So, right, to try it out at least, especially after saying she'll speak anywhere, I would assume. Go ahead.
What did the pre-thought movement, was there any response to her book on her response to Uncle?
Yeah, there were definitely people who were mad about it for sure. Yeah, Well, I'll say there's some serious thoughts with the free thought, serious bad parts, because the free thought movement, especially in the 1880s and 1890s, they get involved in like eugenics and all these kinds of things. So kind of a mix. And I will say, prior to the Civil War, there were a lot of non-religious folks living in the Deep South that would actually go and join the Confederacy. I know we often have this idea of like the Confederacy as a Christian organization, but there were a lot of people on both sides there. So she mostly got it from the abolitionists. The abolitionists absolutely despised that she was doing that. And the National Anti-Slavery Standard really went in on her saying this is just wrong in so many ways. But she kind of fought back a little bit, and I don't know if I believe her that she was just talking about hypocrisy. I would not believe her in that at all. I would say she's absolutely pro-slavery. So it's a great question.
During that, well, did you find any research
Yeah.
about people supporting her book because of her anti-slavery?
I haven't necessarily. I did find she was like the kind of person who would write back when anyone criticized her. In the Bridgeton Chronicle, for example, some of my favorite reading was listening to her writing back and just being like, you're absolutely wrong and just tearing people to shreds, like the Maury Jr. thing, right? I just thought that was hilarious. There were some people who were like, have you read her articles on the results of abolition in New Jersey? But she wasn't like a Harriet Beecher Stowe in terms of popularity, especially in that issue. Like Harriet Beecher Stowe is the most famous person in America for a short while. Hers, like I said, I don't even know if it was ever published into an actual book or if it was just a novella in a newspaper.
So you don't know if she was supported in the South then?
Well, definitely, she definitely like the Maryland-based newspaper loved her. The Cecil Whig absolutely loved her. They there's one other reference to the Constitutional Union maybe being in Alabama, and I would assume if she's writing for a Georgia or an Alabama-based newspaper, they might support her pretty heavily. It's really unfortunate. I've reached out to so many Georgia-based historians. Nobody has ever heard of the Constitutional Union. So maybe I need to make a trip. Yeah.
Baptist churches.
Yeah.
About find that here.
So
Copy here, or
yeah, the picture of it, I found it absolutely. It was the first one I've ever seen in person, and it was held here. That book is really, really rare. Yes, yeah. It was really cool to see in person because you can find like digitized versions on Google Books or whatever else, but it is a really rare book. I guess mostly because it's held in like church libraries and things like that. And I would assume it wasn't. It was published by a New York-based publisher, Blackiston and Lindsay. Um, but I don't know if there's a lot left, to be honest with you.
I don't know about that.
It is in a couple of the Philadelphia ones, like the Philadelphia the library company. Yeah, library company has a copy, but then it's like Brown has one, and then a couple of the church ones. And I wasn't going to drive all the way out there to go see it, so this was better.
you have all the articles that she was writing for her anti-slavery.
So there really wasn't. So this is going to be my project for my PhD program. And I did the worst thing that you can possibly do when you do a project for a PhD program. I transcribed all of her articles to a Word document before I started working on the history for it. So I have like an ebook of her all of her works. And I will say for everyone here is a big Cumberland County history person, in the Chronicle, she wrote short stories based on the history of Cumberland County. So she wrote a short story about Fortescue, about the history of it. It's dead wrong. Everything in it is she said that Fortescue was started by a French Protestant Huguenot who was escaping the French Revolution, and that he sold his daughter into piracy. Like it was like the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But he wrote one on that. He wrote one on Tyndall's Island or Tyndon. You guys know what I'm talking about a little bit. Tyndall's Island. I think she calls it Tyndon's Island, but I would assume it's one and the same. And then she wrote another one about really, really interesting story about the people that wait for the ships, like they'll light a light and let the ships crash on the shoals and then steal all the goods that crash. Yeah. So, yeah.
It sounds, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was thinking about the thing with the passing of the bad bill. It
Yeah.
sounds like it was just like the perfect setup. Not that she was set up, but the perfect accident.
Yeah.
That could have happened to her from like the opponents who did not like her. Because it makes no sense that she would have been counterfeiting the fact that she had so much
That she had money, right? Like,
so much counterfeit in circulation.
Yeah.
Uh,
it's funny because when I went through the Salem County book, there were so many people getting arrested for counterfeiting. It was just like a very, very common thing. And who knows, maybe because she got arrested in 1860, but then she got rearrested in 1864. Did it happen again? I don't even know. So it's one of those things, and you guys as local history people know this. We don't have all the sources, unfortunately. So we won't know unless someone here knows somebody who's a descendant who has some papers that I haven't heard about, what the story was. Yeah.
We didn't have single currency in the time.
Right.
Banks had their own.
Yeah.
So
Who knows? Who knows?
Were any of those forgeries preserved anywhere?
Not that I found. No. I mean, there are definitely examples of counterfeit, for currency from the time that do survive, but none from her. Yeah. In fact, the only place that I've found like her actual signature, Salem County Historical Society kept a couple of her deeds that she signed for land, but that's pretty much it. Like the only items that she touched that have remained. There are no letters, there are no manuscripts, no diaries, no nothing. And so I'm kind of playing with less of an inside view. Yeah,
So sorry. Have you gone to the courthouse in Princeton?
I did. Yeah. They didn't have anything for me. Yeah, I was like hanging out down there and I was hoping not to be arrested. But yeah, I would love if they had something like that. But from what I found when I talked to them, they said that they shipped what they had, most of it, to like the New Jersey State Archives, and then the New Jersey State Archives didn't have anything either, apparently. Sounds good. We'll see if we can find something. That'd be great. Yeah. Well,
it mentioned letters about what a scandal this relative was.
here's a really interesting bit. She had three kids. One was named Casimir, because I assume that she named him after Casimir Pulaski, because she was a big revolutionary history person. And he would become an agent for the Truth Seeker, which was the newspaper that followed up the Boston Investigator in like the 1880s and so on and forth. They would actually buy the Investigator at some point. So he was an agent for Woodstown. And in 1891, he gets sent to an insane asylum, much like his mother, and he would die very young as well. Now, the other two kids, Artesia and Hulda married a man named Charles B. King. She lived in this area, and I think for in my genealogy search, their line kind of died out. Artesia moved to Texas, and her descendants became like the sheriffs of El Paso, Texas. So maybe they have something, but with all the moving and going to Texas, I highly doubt it survived. I have tried to reach out to. Yeah,
I hate to ask.
sure.
What was her husband's involvement or thoughts or reactions? Because it sounds
Yeah.
like she was breadwinner in some capacity.
Well, he was a farmer, and I have found his name attached to like some estate sales and things. In all the reports that I've found, the only times I've ever heard him brought up were like when she got arrested and they said the spiritualism. They were like, and she's married to the very respectable Richard Bond Davis. And one had said her insanity induced by spiritualism was attested by her husband. But that's pretty much it. That's the only thing I really ever found about him. He dies the year before she dies. So maybe there was some heartbreak involved. I don't know, but that's another story I'm kind of missing here. Yeah.
Baptist Church had an academy probably that went back to the 1800s.
Yeah.
Have you done any research to see if she's reported anywhere
Yeah.
within the academy as a student?
Well, she grew up in the Marlborough Church, but I have looked at the Shiloh Church and seen if I could find anything because they did have the academy. I found, I think it went back to like 1848, or even before that. I'm pretty sure they had the academy. Yeah, right. I'll check again and see if I can find it. That's a great idea. Maybe they have something there. I wonder if they.
It's just that the Historical Society now has a series of
Yeah.
several samplers that predate that. So
Yeah.
I think that the school probably could have gone back as far as 1800.
That would be. Could you imagine how excited I'd be if I found a sampler that she did? I would lose it, I think. So that's great advice. Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else have any ideas, thoughts? This is still very much a work in progress, so hopefully in maybe 4 years. Oh, thank you guys. Yeah. Who just outside of the norm in every way possible almost. You know, they said she what was the quote? That generally espoused the contrary side in all opinions. That describes her perfectly. Okay. Well, thank you all. I'll be around if anyone wants to talk and great. Absolutely.
We have two questions online real quick. Have you seen copies of any of her novels, or were they only published in newspapers?
Sorry to my online people. We totally
Okay, he's a staff member.
oh, perfect. So from what I could tell, I haven't found anything that they were actually published as novels. Like actually, they mentioned them in the reports that they were published by Boston and New York based publishers, but I haven't found actual books, and the Library of Congress has no records of them as physical books, only as the newspaper novels, that which basically were like issue by issue almost.
Why do you think she committed perjury?
Money's tough. I mean, right in the Civil War, right in 1860 and then 1864, she wrote pretty heavily poems about the horrors of like men going off and dying at war and sons dying in war. Maybe times were tough. I don't know if her son actually went and served. Maybe Casimir did as well. But maybe. I don't know. Why do people do anything, right?
Thank you guys
Great.
so much.
Thank you, online people.